Hey, St. John. Welcome to the Post-Sermon Podcast. I am Deacon Estalia, and with me today is Vicar Tim.
Hello.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing well. We will be discussing your sermon from this past Sunday. Can you tell us what the text was that you preached on?
Yeah, so the text is Isaiah 12. The whole chapter, because it's only 6 verses. And in particular, I was focusing in on the idea of joy that is found in this text. How Isaiah is talking about how you'll say in that day, you'll give thanks to the Lord, all that, and all of these praises of joy. And so I wanted to kind of draw on the idea of, well, why is it so hard for us to find joy? How do we think about that? How do we respond to that? Where is it that we can find joy in this life?
And I was thinking particularly in verse 3, with joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation. What imagery there to just imagine a well with water and that you're drawing all of that joy out of it.
Yeah, especially if you're living back in a land where you're always kind of on the edge of desperate need for water. I mean, if the rains don't come, you are in trouble. You're just a short ways from the desert where every well is very necessary. That's a powerful image. Maybe one that we take a little bit for granted with our plumbing.
Yeah, maybe we're a little bit more disconnected from that image as opposed to people back in Jesus' day.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that's a really good point of just being close to maybe not having that water and then to read a verse like that. What was your central teaching of the sermon?
So my central teaching is that it's God who brings us true and lasting joy. So part of the problem that we have with trying to find joy is that, well, first off, we tend to equate joy with happiness. And I was kind of trying to draw a distinction between the two, that happiness is often fleeting, it doesn't last, it's very earthly. And happiness can absolutely be good. But it's not quite the same as joy. Joy has a more eternal feel to it. Joy is something that lasts, something that isn't going to go away. And so, going from there, well, we find joy in the things that God does. In Isaiah's text here, the joy is coming from God. There's joy from drawing water from the wells of salvation. That's coming from God. There's joy, praises being sung because of what God has done. And so the fullness of this image is going to be captured in the new creation, in that day when Christ returns, when everything will be perfect. There will be unending joy. These images of singing praises, giving thanks to the Lord, all that. It's very much in that day, in the future, when Christ returns. Of course, that leads to the question of, well, where do we find joy in the here and now?
I was going to say, a question you had asked in the sermon that I think is how you structured it was, why is it so hard to find joy? And you gave different answers to that.
Yeah.
Do you want to go into some of the answers that you said?
Yeah, so talked a little bit about the happiness, how our happiness never really seems to last, and it's really not joy. I mentioned kind of we're not yet in that day when Christ returns, but just the fact that we live in this fallen, sinful world means that we have to try to find joy in a sinful, fallen, even joyless world. And I laid out kind of the image of Isaiah himself walking through the streets of Jerusalem, seeing all of the idolatry, all of the sin going on around him. Yet Isaiah gives us this image of joy in his book. For us, we're in a world full of sin, full of violence, full of places where it's hard to find joy.
And you mentioned how we try to seek joy in joyless places here on earth.
Yeah, that, we're in this violent world. We're in this sinful world. Even the image of we so often try to find joy, like, in what's on our phones. Though it's pretty much all fleeting nonsense. And yet that's where we have to try to find joy, because we're not in the not yet.
How did you intend to benefit your hearers in their faith or life?
Ultimately, we do find joy, and we find joy in the things that God has done, in God's work for us. There's joy to be found in creation. And I was just thinking the other day, I was just walking around outside the church to, clear my head a little bit, and I just stopped on the bridge, as looking down at the creek, and I was just appreciating God's creation. There were a couple of ducks in the creek, and it was beautiful. And I think that's joy, appreciating God's creation. But even more so, there's joy in the gospel, in the sacraments, in Christ's death and his resurrection. I mean, there is joy to be found in that. And that is lasting joy, because the gifts of God don't go away. God's work doesn't end. It doesn't stop. It's not fleeting the way that all of our works here on this earth are.
I love those two examples you gave, like finding joy in God's creation and then also in the gifts he gives us. And it had me reflecting on other ways that God gives us joy. And one I did think of was just like the relationships he's given us in the church, like with one another. Mm-hmm. And I think it can be tough because we're sinner and saint. And so often joy and like pain or turmoil can be companions, right? It's rare you have one without the other, right?
Uh-huh.
And yet when we kind of recognize that happens, we can still see that joy in, well, I'll give your example of communion. Not only are we receiving his body and blood, but who is next to me, right?
Yeah.
Like I have unity with these people right next to me, that we believe in the same thing, that we trust in the same Lord, in that we rely on each other, right? We're dependent on one another. God is using these people as his hands and feet to serve me, and vice versa. I'm serving them. And it's just this really cool thing. And you have these moments of joy when you realize that, right?
Uh-huh.
And I don't know, that was something I thought of.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I have a here's submitted question.
Okay.
What role does prayer play in times of intense suffering that seeks to take our joy?
Yeah, so prayer absolutely plays a role in this. I think as Luther called prayer spiritual warfare, that, when we're afflicted, when we're tempted, when it seems like all the joy's gone out of the world, prayer is a number one place to go to, to talk to God, you pray the Lord's Prayer. Jesus taught us that's how we should pray, that God is going to hear that prayer. And so, yeah, I absolutely think that prayer plays a role in that. And yeah, maybe that would have been an interesting image if to add as part of the sermon, be how prayer works in that, and helping us in those times of suffering.
What was a challenge for you with the sermon process?
Yeah, so one of the challenges with this Isaiah text is that it was like preaching on like an epilogue in a sense. Isaiah 2 to 12 is all incredibly interconnected. Those chapters all very much flow together, and they're all kind of built around what's going on in Isaiah 6 through 8. And so there's kind of a challenge in basically everything Isaiah says in those 6 verses in Isaiah 12 is in some way can connect back to something that he's already said before. And
so he's summarizing a bit of what he said previously? A
little bit. He's drawing on common themes. It's very much flowing out of what's happening in Isaiah 11 as well, which is coming out of what's happening in Isaiah 10. It's all kind of building together, and how to kind of get some of those ideas to flow together and, talk about the text that isn't, having a hour-long Bible study on it. That was a bit of a challenge. And, there were some places where I did kind of, reference other parts of Isaiah, even though it was somewhat subtly, like, when I had Isaiah walking through, seeing all the different idols that he sees, there really was a idol that the wicked King Ahaz built in the temple to a god of Assyria. I was, referring back to chapter 8, I believe, for that. Referred to chapter 11 with the image of, in that day there will be joy, in the image of the, what is it? The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together. That's image from Isaiah 11. Even an image of hands that are holding, swords and spears and weapons of war instead of, plows. That's drawing on an image in Isaiah chapter 2. So I was trying to kind of weave some of those things in there. Almost as like, here's a little tidbit if you remember your Isaiah, and if you didn't, now you know. So
yeah, that seems so difficult. Like, especially, just a book like Isaiah, and then you get such a short chapter. And that's really interesting. I didn't realize that chapter 12 was like the epilogue, you said, of the...
Yeah, it's like the conclusion of that
whole
thing, because then in chapter 13 you move into like just completely different themes and ideas.
Right. So you're trying to, like, when you're preaching or when you're writing the sermon, you're trying to, people might not be as familiar with all of that, right? But trying to, still include that, but not let it be difficult for the hearer to understand and be able to focus on your primary message about joy coming from the Lord.
Yeah. Yeah. Because, in church you hear the text in a vacuum, and,
yep.
Sometimes, the text, it's fine in that. Other times it's like, the context really, really matters to this. It's not just an isolated group of 6 verses, but it's, even by many biblical standards, these chapters of Isaiah are heavily intertwined with each other. And if you really want to go deep, one of a former seminary professor counted all of the syllables in the Hebrew in those chapters to prove how they are interconnected. So.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I look forward to your Isaiah Bible study. No, I don't know if you'll have time for that before the end of your vicarage.
There's only 66 chapters. I think we can do it.
That'd be tough. That'd have to be like an everyday kind of Bible study until you leave. I was also going to mention, so we're getting to the end of the season of Easter, but, we still are in this resurrection season, and thinking about that, and just the theme of joy, and this joy that comes from God. Like, did that play a role in when you were writing your sermon?
Yeah. Well, every Sunday is another mini Easter.
That's true too. Yeah.
That's, church is a place of joy. That, again, every Sunday Christ is risen, and there's joy that comes from that. We receive God's gifts there. Even as we move through the Easter season and even out of the Easter season, it's still Easter on Sunday morning.
This wraps up the episode for today. Thank you for listening to our discussion. In case you missed today's sermon or wanted to listen to it again, the link to the sermon's in the show notes, and you can also find it on our church website, stjohndublin.org. If you, the listener, would like to submit a question about a sermon, please email us at podcast@stjohndublin.org. Thank you, Vicar, for joining me and for feeding us the word this week.
My pleasure.
All right, take care, you guys. Bye.
Bye.